Hello, thank you to everyone who came this morning. And I also want to acknowledge the people who welcomed us here onto the unceded land of Gadigal. And if I pronounced that correctly, Gadigal, right? Yes. And I appreciate that they've welcomed us here. This morning, we're here to look at the intersection of sport and development and what that means for young women and girls, and looking with a gender lens, which gender also includes boys and men. So we have some interesting things maybe to pick apart. But the area of development in general is quite contested in this world at this moment. And whether or not sport has a role in development is something that I think everyone on the panel here has grappled with. So the way we're going to run this is everyone is going to introduce themselves and the work that they do. And then my name is Martha Saavedra. I will have some questions for them to try to dig into exactly what these intersections are. So why don't we start with Kylie at the end?
My name is Kylie. I work with Right to Dream. Right to Dream is a football academy. It was started in Ghana in 1999, and it was actually started as a boys' academy. Our founder Tom saw a lot of talent in Ghana, but a lack of opportunity for players and students. So he started, brought students in, brought players in, and then in 2013, we added girls. So Right to Dream, it's not only a football academy, but we look at academics and character building as well. So we have multiple pathways. Some of our players will go on to play professionally. Some of them go on to school in the US. And we then in 2015 also added a professional club in Denmark. So we have an academy and professional club in Denmark as well. And then just 2 years ago that we also announced that we're expanding to Egypt so that we can provide more opportunities for kids in Egypt. And it's totally scholarship based. We go out to the communities and find and host trials and look where kids normally would be overlooked and not have those opportunities. So we really want to provide opportunities for those kids that might have fallen out of the system and provide them both academic and football opportunities. And then we're actually expanding to the US soon as well. And then my role is I work across our women and girls programs across all of our locations. So we recently started a women's team in Egypt as well, a women's professional team, which one thing, it's obviously very different going into Egypt than in Ghana, being a Muslim country. So we're starting with the women's professional team to really kind of build up our reputation and trust with families. And then we're going to add a girls' academy in Egypt in a couple of years' time as well. So I get to kind of work with our girls on the ground, building out the right environments. Because I think we started as a boys' academy, and oftentimes things can be viewed through that lens. But I really work to ensure that the environments are the right for our girls, that the pathways are right for our girls, and that we're providing the best experience specific to our girls.
I'm Gabby Garten. I guess I don't really have a development program. I'm rather a researcher. So I'll talk a little bit about my doctoral research. I was studying basically elite women's football in Argentina, and my dissertation was in ethnography of one of the more successful clubs in women's football in Argentina that was amateur basically until 2019. I suppose it's might be interesting to say about how my research actually began. I went to university in the US. My mother's from Argentina, and I wanted to continue playing football. Just didn't really know where, but thought there might be an opportunity in Argentina where my grandparents were based. And I had the opportunity to train with the Argentine women's national team in 2011. And coming from playing NCAA Division I in the US, I was expecting similar or better conditions, and I found quite the opposite. I found us a team of over 20 players having to get dressed and changed in a change room that was prepared for futsal. So it was like for 11 people, there were 25 of us trying to get changed. We were wearing clothes that were from like 2 World Cup cycles before, that were from what the boys academy or the youth national teams hadn't used or had already used. I found players, I had, there were girls training next to me that had their boots stitched up because they couldn't afford to buy new boots in a national team setting. And I was, probably a bit naive and surprised as to why I was surprised. I think I was expecting, like I said, something at least like the college setup where, you'd have your gear prepared for you, you'd have at least a new pair of boots per season, and these girls were playing all the biggest and the best clubs in Argentina, but I was so surprised for them to tell me that, there were weeks that they would go, or actually months, and sometimes they'd go months without playing because, a game would get suspended because it was raining too much, or because a referee wouldn't show up to the match, or because they were missing a police official. And so when I would tell them that in university we'd have 2 games a week and we knew our schedule from like months before and we were traveling all over the country, they thought that was something that was like unreal, like they couldn't imagine that as being a reality. And so I was sort of like, oh, I've got to change this. So I had this kind of very much a Western mentality that I was going to be able to make change in Argentina, but I was interested, first of all, knowing what were the reasons behind it. So I moved to Argentina in 2013 and began playing for River Plate, one of the biggest clubs in South America, if not the world. And yeah, the conditions there were pretty poor. We would train on a synthetic pitch, but we get kicked off of it if the academy needed it, which I'm not talking about the academy of boys that are going into the professional pathway. I'm talking about boys whose parents are paying for them just to train at the club. Like it would be sort of like sending your kids to, I don't know, like a camp basically here. And they would have priority over the first division women's team. We had a coaching staff that would do their best, but it was kind of like a mishmash of whoever was available to work with us. And yeah, I think that I sort of was a bit lucky in finding some of the better actually researchers in sport in Argentina who took me under their wing and said, I think there's an opportunity here for you to carry out some do a postgraduate degree in social science and do some more work here because you have a very unique access to this space. And yeah, I think what was interesting for me, particularly I'll kind of jump ahead, is that the game has grown significantly since that first moment of contact in 2011. I'm not going to take any credit. I think there's been progress of a lot of work and kind of struggles from players from prior generations, but also I think the newest wave of feminism has had a real impact in football in Argentina and in the region, I would say as well. Making it a more acceptable space for girls and women, increasing visibility. Just even with the World Cup, I'd say Argentina achieving qualification for the 2019 World Cup was a major I think it was a major factor in kind of the growth of the game. I think had Argentina not qualified for that, I don't think that the league would have been professionalized. Like it was crazy because you went from having conversations with cab drivers saying, "Oh, I didn't even know River Plate had a women's team," to all of a sudden going to the shops and having the person who's serving you say, "Oh, did you watch the girls in the Women's Cup, like the Women's World Cup? That was amazing. They drew Scotland, like they came back and won 3-3. It was or even hearing men talking amongst themselves about results for the games, the things that were completely unheard of just a few years before. And then beginning to have players going overseas and playing in major clubs, and also I think that was a massive factor in them seeing other realities that were possible. Taking a little bit from the Brazilian academic Paulo Freire, having the ability to see possibilities beyond your own world, I think is really important to be able to generate social change. And I think for the Argentinian women, like I said, when I came with my reality from the States, it was just too foreign. They didn't think it was a possibility for them to be able to see those conditions. But when players that were from the same, that had grown up in the same conditions of having to play with boys and without the support that they needed, were able to go overseas and come back and say, you know what, these conditions, we don't have to accept these conditions. Like, better is possible. And I think that's where we were kind of able to generate more of a bottom up kind of change. I don't want to take up too much time, but I was just finished with this a little bit of I'm optimistic about where the game's going, but as I mentioned on yesterday's panel, I think there are still will be struggles because there is a power struggle occurring between the players trying to push the game forward, society wanting the game to move forward, and then kind of, yes, the remaining powers that be in the federation and some, you know, in the media, and other powerful parts of society that want football to remain a man's domain and want to maintain control over the area. So it'll be kind of interesting to see what happens, but I think that there's no going back, I think, to where it was.
My name is Nico Schulenkopf. I'm a professor of sport management at the wonderful institution DAST, which is the role over there, UTS. So short trip for me today. I've been involved in sport for development, mainly from a research perspective for the last 15 or 20 years, I'd say. And I've seen that space grow significantly, similar to the comparisons we made around women's football. The entire space of sport for development and using sports intentionally for achieving development outcomes has received, certainly from the academic side, more specific attention over the last 20 years. There was a lot of stuff happening before then, but this concentrated push for sport as a development tool, I think, has grown immensely over the last 20 years. And I think it's a wonderful development in that way. Still, I believe that there's a lot of misunderstanding of what sport may or may not achieve and how we can contribute to making positive change or contributing to positive change. And I guess my experience in that space has largely been initially in post-war, post-conflict scenarios in Sri Lanka, also in Israel, but more recently, we've shifted focus more to the Pacific Islands, our neighboring islands over here, which are often a little bit overlooked or neglected from a development perspective. And it's an interesting context at the moment where Australia and New Zealand are certainly trying to put a lot more effort and support in the Pacific for different reasons. But it's a space where sport has been appreciated and celebrated for a long time, particularly for men and boys though. And there's a lot of opportunities for boys to get involved in sport at the grassroots level, and rugby, different form of football, but rugby league and also soccer are big sports over there for participation for boys, but for girls a lot less so. There's a lot less opportunities for girls to be involved in sport generally, to have specific programs that are more attractive for girls to participate. And so with the work that we've been doing at UTS, we've been trying to work with sport organizations, but also NGOs to even facilitate opportunities for women and girls in particular to get involved in the first place and to build some structures and work with sport organizations to build pathways and opportunities to have girls play sport at the very grassroots level in the first place. And against the context of the most overweight and obese region in the world, I think that's got a very high relevance, even if it's not leading towards the elite, but just to have a lot more girls and women regularly involved in supporting their children to be involved as well. So that's my space. So the sport for development world, where I guess from an academic perspective, we've been coming a long way, but a very contested space as well. And I guess we'll probably get into this a little bit in our discussion today.
Thank you. I just want to provide a brief background on where I'm coming from to guide some of these questions. So at the University of California, Berkeley, and I run the Center for African Studies there, and do some research on the side. And my own research before sport was on development, agrarian development, and in Sudan, where definitely there's conflict going on right now. So looking at that is maybe a long way from sport, but always having been involved in sport, at some point I realized as an academic I could study it, and because I'd already done development, it was natural that those two things came together. I am not what Richard Giulianotti, I don't think any of us are what Richard Giulianotti would call a sport evangelist, though. There is no special magic about sport. You could be cooking and you could cook good food or bad food. With sport, likewise, you can do it well, you can do it badly. Sport can be dangerous, sport can hurt people. So in order to combine sport to achieve development, and that is also a contested space, a very contested space. Jean isn't here yesterday, but she mentioned the means of production, and I have to say, a little bit of that Marxist training in me as well. To not necessarily trust that that this world of sport, and when we can all appreciate how big FIFA is, or the International Olympic Committee, or all the federations and the clubs and things like that, they have a lot of interests at heart. So that somehow sport would magically produce a better world for people, especially for young people, and especially for young women who are often left out of development in general. And often bear the brunt, especially in some of the spaces I'm familiar with, bear the brunt of when things aren't going well. It's a question. So in my own research, looking at sport and development, I have come across a couple of organizations that I think actually are doing some good work. One of them, for instance, is Moving the Goalposts. It's in Kilifi, Kenya. And again, my research is mostly in Kenya, in Africa. But I also started working with Soccer Without Borders. And I actually met them because I was coaching, and I met them on the field, and I saw what they were doing on the field, and I saw the way that they were working with people on the field. And Soccer Without Borders works with refugees and newcomers, and specifically with girls. So they have programs in the United States, in Nicaragua, and Uganda. And I think one of the things, and I'm going to turn it back over to some of the questions, is with both of these organizations, Moving the Goalposts and Soccer Without Borders, is the intentionality of what they're doing, and realizing that it takes training, it takes a lot of hard work. You have to build databases, you have to make sure people know what they're doing, you have to find fields. So there's a lot of detailed work, and anybody that's ever organized a tournament or a conference knows, to get everything to come together is hard. And those little pieces are really important, but it's also really important how you treat your people. So one of my current interests is that in the internal governance of these so-called NGOs that do a lot of this work. But I in my world back at Berkeley, I also hang out with a lot of the development economists, and they do impact evaluation like the World Bank, trying to figure out, where are we going to put precious resources that we think are going to improve water supplies or improve health or improve education. And there's different ways you can do things. And when I talk to them about sport, they all roll their eyes and say, there's no evidence that sport does any good. So this is an interesting space. And I mentioned in an earlier email that I'm really interested to see if anybody can come up with some impact evaluations. I do know a few, but I want to turn it over to questions now. In terms of the work that you've either done or observed, what makes things work? What makes things come out better? What's necessary to have a good sport project or experience that actually produces some good for the people involved? And maybe, I don't know, Nico, you have the mic. You want to start here? We can just mix it up a little bit.
Around that way, okay. Yeah, it's a very good question, because it's everyone's sort of trying to solve what's in the black box and what's needed to have success in sport for development, and then also to prove that it's actually gone well. And from my perspective, and working with different sport organizations that have sport for development at heart, and especially when we talk about international sport for development and ideas of international support, the term sustainability is a contested one, but it's also an important one, and I think it's a critical one to look at when we look at sport for development. Unfortunately, I'm saying this because we've seen such an uptake of sport organizations that want to be in this space, but not very many have actually lasted for a long time. Now, when I look at Right to Dream and I see that they've been working in this space since 1999, I believe, and have been growing steadily, perhaps not massively, but steadily and with intent and purpose towards the longer term, growing slowly, but safely. I think that's a recipe that has worked well. Now, my work in Oceania, we've got the Oceania Football Confederation, which is the body like UEFA in Europe. We've got OFC, the Oceania Football Confederation here, and their Sport for Development program, Just Play. I've worked closely with them for the last over 10 years, and they've had this crossroads at some stage to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going deeper or are we going wider? So that means, are we going to use the existing programs that are actually strengthening long-term relationships through sport? Are we building capacity long-term and eventually having a sustainable approach where international input is no longer needed in a way to run programs independently? That would also mean it comes at the expense of going wider. So that means having more programs for more kids and offer opportunities for young people to get involved in sport. So it's a really tricky one to do. In my experience, I would say the approach that perhaps Right to Dream or the OFC have taken to grow perhaps more slowly, but with intent and support of programs to have the chance to build capacity also from a management space, and handing over programs to run independently is the key to success. It may not look as grandiose and big, and the numbers aren't probably inflated as much and please funders in that sense, but it is the one that for me has a sustainable future and much more success long term.
I suppose I'll talk about it, not so much the sport for development, but more of the development of maybe elite pathways. Thinking about the Argentine context, I think you can see, or I guess we can do a kind of a comparison of how Australia and Argentina have gone about things. If you think about the professional league, the A-leagues here have been in existence for quite some time now. They've taken more of definitely a slow approach. I don't know, maybe too slow to a certain extent. Starting with a very short season, less teams, and eventually, hopefully, in the next few years, we'll hopefully be having a full home and away tournaments, 52-week contracts. As many teams are in the men's competition, but making sure all along the way, working specifically with Professional Footballers Australia, so the player union here, working together to create a space where minimum standards are always in place, where you make sure that players have access to medical staff, that players are being coached by people with the right qualifications, that they're in safe environments, that again the standards of competition are maintained high. Then you have the other extreme of Argentina jumping into a professional competition again in 2019 with 20 teams, of which probably 4 have the resources to really be able to sustain a professional environment for their players. And since the professionalization of women's football in Argentina, you've had, I think, 3 claims or processes against coaches for abuse. I think there's certainly not the safeguarding measures in place that need to be there. And I would say for the men's game too. I think kind of on a side note here, when we talk about like looking at things through a gender lens, I think that's what women's football has also brought to football, period. It's given us the opportunity to not just reassess what needs to be done in the women's game, but kind of going to what Theo was saying, is it gives us the opportunity to rethink or reimagine just sport in general. So when we think about safeguarding measures or how female players may be more susceptible to different kinds of sexual abuse or harassment, I think it also gives us the lens to say, okay, well, potentially academy boys as well, especially in some of these countries where it's very typical in Argentina and a lot of other South American countries as well, where you get boys from very remote areas, from very difficult socioeconomical backgrounds, being, moving at the ages of like 12, 13 years old to academies in big cities where who knows who is watching these kids, like who is taking care of them. And there was actually a case at one of the biggest clubs in Argentina, and really nothing came of it, where basically one of the staff was running a prostitution ring amongst the boys. They were two very high profile referees, government officials, and probably people within AFA as well. But when you're the one in control of regulating what's going on amongst your member associations and their staffs, it's very difficult. I think, you don't have an independent body that's really undertaking any sort of investigation or making sure that those children are protected. And in the women's game, you're putting girls into that same exact framework without really even, thinking, okay, well, what sort of processes are in place to make sure that, first of all, that they're in a safe environment, that the people that are coaching them are, have the capacity to do so from a football standpoint, but also, making sure that they have, I think doing any due diligence in any of those clubs that did have problems with their coaches, you would have seen that they'd already had incidents in the past. So, and one of those coaches was actually put in charge of the U15 and U17 national teams in Argentina. And FIFA came back and said, after having 5 players testify against him, saying that wasn't enough evidence to actually sanction him. I guess the good thing that came of that was that he's no longer coaching national teams, but he is in charge of women's football at a massive club in Southern Buenos Aires as well. So it's not entirely out of the game. But going back to this development question, I think I guess I still remain optimistic because even though, like I said, the powers that be are currently maybe don't have the best interests of the players at heart, I think there are other groups in Argentina that are, and I think if you look at the different contexts and also if you look at Chile, Colombia, and some of these other places where the federations aren't really looking after their players. There are other organizations that are coming alongside. In Argentina, particularly some feminist organizations, a lot of feminist media outlets as well have been important to shine a light on kind of the abuses that go on. And yeah, I would like to say the Player Association in Argentina, but that's not exactly the case. Don't quote me on that. But in Chile, for example, there's it's a very interesting situation in that they had a player association that was born out of women's football originally, and then the existing men's players association has really kind of taken them under their wing and helped them grow and achieve professionalization through a legal pathway through Congress. Actually, Congress is the one that decided that women's football in Chile will be professional and will be kind of undertaken that way. So there's some different kind of ways things that are happening around the world, and I think it would be maybe potentially for future research to kind of do a bit of a comparison around what has worked and what hasn't, and what things, obviously it's difficult to apply what's happened exactly in different countries because you also have to consider context. But I think there's definitely room for comparison and thought processes. But I think first and foremost, when we're thinking about developing and growing the game, making sure that we're doing it in a way that we protect the players and specifically like the youngest and most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think kind of like what Nico was saying is what the organizations that Martha was talking about, moving the goalposts, they have a large scale, and that's something that I've always kind of struggled with. There are so many that we can support that we want to support, and especially in Ghana, not many girls are playing football, but we have chosen to go deep instead of going so wide. But then I think what's really special about that, the impact you can have with those few. We only have 15 girls actually at our academy in Ghana at the moment, and we have some studying in the US, and we are looking to grow the program. But if I was down in Ghana a few weeks ago, and we went around the room and asked all of our girls, who's your role model? And every single one of them said a male footballer. And most of them European male footballers. And I think, you know, what we're really striving to do is create these female role models, these African female role models, because our girls aren't seeing them. And so that's, you know, where I really see where we can have, you know, great impact is building up kind of this next generation of leaders, hopefully, and then girls that want to then invest in their communities and change their communities, be role models for the next girls coming through. And I think that's what's so powerful, you know. I brought female footballers in to speak with the girls, and they've never seen girls that have gone before them, kind of taken that pathway. We've just, you know, in the past, I think another thing that's really important for us is, you know, allowing choice for our girls, you know, providing opportunities, but allowing choice and allowing them to kind of find their passions and their purpose in that, and then, you know, giving them the opportunity to choose. Our first few girls, because there wasn't as much money in professional football, they all kind of went to the US to study, which they received great opportunities there. But, you know, it came to a point where are we kind of forcing them there, or are we allowing them to really choose? Are we giving them options? So that's something that, you know, we're really looking at. And we actually last year, our first girl female player from Ghana signed for our professional team in Denmark, and now seeing it. So she's playing professionally in Denmark, you know, on the European stage. And then it's so special to see how she's kind of then changing the narrative for our girls, you know, setting that standard and taking the responsibility as a role model, but then allowing the other girls kind of look up to her and give them something to strive for as well. So I guess for me, you know, really having those role models, but allowing choice as well for girls and opportunities, different various options.
I have one more question for everybody, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I don't know, John, how much more time do we have?
Got about 15 minutes.
Okay, so the final question here, and I want to say I'm super glad you mentioned safeguarding, because that I was like, oh, should we talk about safeguarding or should we talk about challenges? And safeguarding is a challenge. And I will just say that safeguarding staff as well as participants and then the larger community is an ongoing process that, I mean, every organization, sport, development, whatever, has to deal with. But it's a constant process that one needs to keep in the front. But my final question though is in terms of either the organizations you've been studying or seeing from the inside or working directly on, what is the biggest challenge out there? Like, what is it that is the conundrum that you're still not quite sure how it's going to work out, or that the organization is striving to somehow deal with? And maybe we'll start down here at the end with that. It's the microphone there.
Well, actually, Martha and I were talking about this yesterday. I think mental health is a big area where we need to improve. We need to provide better support. So not only do we have, you know, in Ghana, we have 100 students living there, but then also our kids go on various pathways. Some of them are playing professionally in Europe. Some of them are studying in the US. Some of them, you know, are studying other places in Africa. And I think oftentimes it gets overlooked, but also, you know, it's mental health challenges are seen very differently in Ghana and in a lot of places in Africa as well. So we are working on, we're needing to educate our staff better on how to provide support for our young people and not only, you know, while they're there, but as they go on, you know, and you know, we have girls studying in the US. They go at 15 years old, they leave the academy and they go to boarding schools in the US. And I think we don't often realize, I mean, that's a huge life change, kind of leaving everything that they've ever known, their families, you know, their culture, their food. And we know that, you know, they need support around them, but they don't often realize kind of that they need help or that they need support, and we're not always there, you know, we can't physically be there with them. So it's really providing the structures, the support, the network, the resources for them to be able to support them, for them to be able to thrive in all environments that they go in, much less like, I mean, they're in these high performing environments as well. So yeah, definitely, I think mental health is an area, that is a struggle for us, but it's kind of really, really important for us to improve.
And we'll work with you on that.
Yes, yes.
I think in thinking about Latin America in particular, there are a lot of challenges. But I would say, kind of maybe also taking the player association route. I think that, I mentioned like the players in the national team maybe starting to have a different sort of consciousness or awareness around what conditions are professional and what is acceptable and what they should be expecting, representing the national team. But I think that consciousness is difficult to also communicate amongst the players who are in that first division in Argentina and below. And I think you could probably expand that to other parts of Latin America. That awareness that, or kind of, I think it's almost fighting that gratitude complex, that I'm just happy to be here. So I've got to put up with everything that the club does to me, or that my staff, that the staff does to me. I think creating, but that also goes towards like their own self-worth and self-value. And I think like when I think about what sport has given me personally, and I've seen what it has given other teammates and people that I look up to as well, is that ability to, know what you're worth, no matter what, a coach might think at the time, or no matter how well or poorly you're doing on the pitch. And I think to a certain extent, like I've seen how players in the national team and in some of the more elite teams as well in Argentina, have begun to understand their own worth. And I think that's been something that's been beautiful to see. But I still think that for a lot of young girls and women, that's a struggle in a culture that doesn't necessarily value you for your abilities beyond, the capacity to become a mother or to, be a caretaker in a family. There's a really great organization that is called La Nuestra that works in Buenos Aires in one of the biggest slums, or I can't remember the term in English, but it's La Villa 31, which they work only with women. It's a feminist organization. Monica Santino was kind of it's her creation, but she's brought on an amazing team of mainly young women to help run this organization. And their main goal isn't necessarily to produce the next professional star or the next star of the women's national team, but they go into these spaces. They have been able to, so the barrio, the neighborhood they work in, has 2 synthetic pitches that were built, I think, by the state. And historically, those had always been occupied by men and boys. And they have been able to establish that 2 days a week, that pitch is theirs, and it belongs to the women and the girls of the neighborhood. And it's funny because now you see when those girls are training and playing on the pitch that like the young men and boys of the neighborhood, they come and watch the sessions. And it's been important, not because of, again, like what those girls are able to then do on the pitch, but that means that they can drop their caretaking responsibilities or pass it off to somebody else at home, or understand that they have the right to also enjoy a part of life, and they can go out and they can have fun for a period of time. And I don't know. I know it's slightly different from the elite level, but I think there's a connection there because a lot of the girls that I have played with have grown up not necessarily in slums, but certainly definitely in similar financial circumstances and difficulties at home. And also just understanding that, you have the right to enjoy life and you have the right to go out and have fun on a football pitch. And I think, again, like we're not all going to become Marta, or we're not all going to be able to win a World Cup, like the US national team or whoever ends up winning it this year. But I think at the end of the day, when we think about football and what it can bring to people, I think it's that ability to enjoy and to make lifelong friendships and bring that aspect to life. So I think having that challenge of making sure that girls understand their worth, I think is one that's, you know, worth overcoming, but definitely difficult.
Thanks, Gabby. I think I want to build a little bit on that because for me, one of the critical things from a sport management perspective, and particularly in international development, is the ability to achieve that process of transferring power and control and responsibility from external international donors to local organizations. And I want to build on it because I think this happens on the pitch and as well off the pitch. So if we're managing or running programs and we've got international organizations supporting that, and perhaps they are starting a program, I don't know if it's in the Pacific Islands, eventually that transfer and control of what's happening needs to be at least shifted at some stage throughout this funding process towards local organizations or local people, local women, to eventually run programs or to sustain programs, back to that initial thought, independently. Because otherwise we're setting this up for a perpetuating, never-ending funding need that really is against the entire idea of development. And I know that the entire development space has been grappling with that for a long time, but it has then, now coming to challenges and opportunities, also has a requirement to build that into program management from the start. So when we're looking at empowerment, which there'll be another session on empowerment later on, empowerment of local staff to sustain these programs, empowerment of course, women, of course, to grow on the field, but also off the field. So the capacity building isn't just related to on-field performance and pathways. Also, from a management perspective, it's part of a sustainable approach to development work, where sport can achieve so many things, but only if it's intentionally designed to do so. And I think that's my key takeaway here from designing programs in a way that they are achieving their intended outcomes and doing so purposefully from the start.
Okay, thank you. I know that there's a lot more that we all could say, but perhaps there are a few questions. We maybe can, maybe we have time for 2 or 3 questions, maybe. 1 or 2. Okay, that's what I was stretching it. Any questions from the floor?
Last question.
You want the mic?
I'll just talk really loudly.
Okay.
So when you think about the sustainability and how you can work with them, a lot of times I imagine when we think about working in sport, it's very focused on athletes, the people immediately around those things, but probably a lot that contributes to that individual coming to that sport and that organization is the culture around it. So what are ways that you've seen work well to help shift the general culture of that entire society to improve and help more women, that it's normalized for them to be in the playing sport?
Okay, and just in case the online audience, the question's about culture and shifting that for sustainability.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And in Ghana, it's a little bit like what Gabby was saying, is kind of in the home, a lot of girls are not allowed to go out and play, and they're expected to be home to help mom, to, you know, help with the chores, help with the cooking. The brothers can go out and play, but the daughters have to, you know, have to stay home. And so that is a big thing that we're really kind of facing. And there is some change, but it's slow. And that's an area where we are trying to do more. So I think a big thing is kind of educating parents, getting out in the community and educating parents, you know, hosting events. We had a girls' event a few weeks ago in the city, went around, talked to coaches, and you don't even have many girls teams. So you don't even have many coaches coaching girls teams because there aren't the girls playing, but also the coaches don't really see the financial benefit. Where if they're coaching boys, you know, they might have the 1 or 2 that are sold on, they make money, but it doesn't happen that way on the girls' side. So we need to be doing more, but kind of we're starting in that space now, just trying to kind of mobilize local coaches, provide fun events for the girls, but even going into the schools as well. So a lot of the kids do get to play sports in school, even if they don't necessarily get to join teams outside of that, but going into the schools and trying to encourage the girls to play through the schools, just to build their connection with football, with sport, with movement, And then we're hoping that it can grow that way, but also doing education with families. And then hoping to, as we raise up those role models, that they'll see more females at the forefront of sport. I know the Ghana Football Association on the women's side has always been strong, but they are investing more money there as well. They got a new coach for the national team in January and trying to kind of raise the level at the national team level. So I do think as the women's professional side grows, then hopefully more girls can see potential and possibility within football as well.
And I just want to mention really quickly an organization, or it's a project actually, Coaching Boys into Men, that it's been used in the United States in a couple places. Soccer Without Borders is implementing it in East Africa right now, and Moving the Goalpost has a similar program where you're actually working with the fathers and the boys and trying to shift the culture that way. And they actually do have some RCTs, randomized controlled trials, on those, which are kind of interesting to look at.
I think that the media actually has a big role in this as well. One thing I've seen in South America is that we're the countries where, like, you've seen the national teams, especially the girls, go on to play, for example, in the World Cup, and they're more visible, and all of a sudden, parents are saying, oh, it's not like there are girls that can actually play this game. Like it's not just something that boys and men can do, because there are certainly stereotypes and long-lasting ideas around what girls can and can't do with their bodies in most of the world. But I think that having that ability to see that our typical ideas around gender norms can be challenged, I think that's important, and that the media has a big role in that. But I want to bring it kind of back to Australia a little bit, and I don't know, it's not so much, I don't think maybe not an answer, but more of a question or a challenge for those of us who might be working in the community space. Obviously, like, I think it was brought up yesterday, it's great to see the Matildas doing so well, but when we look at how the team is composed, it's not necessarily representative of Australia's population, right? I think when we talk about the challenge of getting to 50-50 gender equality in all areas of football, like Football Victoria, for example, has set a goal to reach 50-50 gender equality by 2027, which I don't know that they'll reach it, but it's really great that they put that goal in place. And I know they're working with Victoria University on trying to create capacity at the club, especially community club level, around what are the things that clubs can do in terms of making their own environments better and more welcoming to girls and women. But there's also this idea that how are we going to get to that number if we're just competing for the same girls? If we're competing with netball, we're competing with footy, or like I guess in Victoria competing with Aussie rules football, here maybe competing with rugby. But I think it's because we're always trying to compete for the same Anglo white blonde girls. But we are having that problem in communities, especially migrant communities. How do we reach those girls? How do we get those girls involved in the sport? And I think that there is maybe that cultural barrier that clubs aren't even really thinking through. But it's certainly a way to get more girls and women involved in sport. And I think I'll leave it as a challenge for those of you who might be working here in local clubs, just to think about, okay, well, when we want to bring more girls and women into sport, how do we not always look for the same girls? How do we reach those communities that would really benefit, I hope, from being involved in sport, and what that means as well in terms of belonging to a new place too. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there as well.
Final word.
Very briefly, great question, and one specific example from the Pacific. Again, you want to reach your target audience, you have to find the right people who can achieve that, and they're often not in sport because they're preaching to the converted. Pacific Islands, if you win over the reverend of that church, okay, they'll talk to mothers and fathers every day. After church, you straight away have it organised that there is a sport access to facilitate opportunities. That's been our big win. And, we initially never thought of the church, but it was in the Pacific that's where you reach that audience of mothers who influence the kids, and the fathers who allow the mothers to, have the girls play. It's just, that's the way to do it. So look beyond sport, sometimes the message here for me.
Okay, thank you, and we will hand it back over to John at this point.
Great, yeah, great.